everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Chapman, author. And on today's episode of Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, we're going to be talking about the 21 narcissistic traits in children. So I think that that's always a very interesting type of subject for us to get into, because narcissism is very much of a key word that we hear more about today and is very much part of our sibling estrangement community in terms of experiences that people have. So, Fern, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you. This is an important topic, and it actually came out of our support group. Somebody asked, can you identify narcissism in children? And that spurred me on to do some research, and I found that actually there are certain traits that are identifiable. However, you have to be really careful with this. Children go through developmental stages, and you really have to beware of concluding that somebody's a narcissist, certainly before they're 12 and even after they're 12. It's possible to identify these traits after 12, and it certainly should raise some red flags, but it is inconclusive. However, I'll also say that some of these traits not only are identifiable in children, but they're also identifiable in adults. So the traits you are going to hear today are probably familiar to you, as you have seen some of them in adult narcissistic behavior.
You know, I think this is such an interesting subject for us to do today, Fern, because people have been asking, right? How do you find out if those traits are present or not in children, right? How do you see it manifesting and coming in some way so you can perhaps prevent it or do something about it, right?
Yeah, as a parent, what can you do about it?
Mm-hmm. So I think this is really, really interesting, because this leads us into our first part, which is basically identifying what causes this to happen in some people, right? I think this is a really, really important question that a lot of us are asking, especially. And one of the first things that happens, of course, when it comes to manifesting narcissism in kids is the idea of overvaluing them. You know, so according to social learning theory, you know, overvaluing a child can cause them to internalize that they're special, and even more so than other children. And if people see them as being constantly perfect, if parents tend to overlook their flaws, for example, like this can cause them to develop a type of ego that makes them think that they're better than others, and that people in their surroundings are actually under them, right?
Mm-hmm. You know, parents have such a challenging role, and they worry a lot about, am I overindulging? Am I underindulging? Particularly if they did not have strong parental role models. And so I can see how you could get very tripped up by all of this. There also has been a tendency in parenting trends, I guess I'd call it, where you do try to raise the child's self-esteem. And so you may overstate that, and that can lead to some of these problems.
You're absolutely right. I think that this is usually based on the idea of building a child's self-esteem, which is good. Inherently, that's well-intentioned. We all need to do that. We want for our children to feel that they feel good about themselves. But at the same time, there can be too much of a good thing or not enough of a good thing, as we'll see too, right?
Right.
Because I think that with certain theories, like in psychoanalytic theory, for example, it suggests that if a parent doesn't express warmth, positive regard, or appreciation for their child, or they see their child as a burden, for example, children may seek this sense of approval from elsewhere or outside of themselves. And they can even, in some instances, give themselves excessive value as a way to compensate for their parents' lack of warmth, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, if you do a combination of these two things, overindulge and underindulge, you're really creating a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I find it really interesting as a psychotherapist, right? Because I have people coming to me in therapy because of the lack of feedback that they had while growing up, you know, and they really felt that they had a lack of direction in their lives. So some people even consult for reasons like this, and this really creates all sorts of types of issues, I think, with some people, because if they can't evaluate themselves clearly, then that can also create problems in learning to read your environment, for example, and things of that nature.
Or replicating these relationships.
So number three is the experience of trauma, and that's really, really important as well too, because some people will experience abuse from a parent or from another situation that can cause trauma, be it in the form of physical, emotional aspects, or due to neglect, or feeling abandoned, or even trauma of a sexual nature. So sometimes children will feel that they need to develop coping mechanisms, and of course, as anybody. And this can manifest as a lack of empathy, the need to control, or the feeling of being entitled. And, some traumas are relationship based, they can be victimization based, or even identity based, and we may cover this in an upcoming episode.
I also wanted to make the point that you can have several siblings in a family and have the same types of treatment, and some of them will become narcissistic and some may not. It's a very individual thing. And it's fascinating. So many siblings get upset that somebody's narcissistic in the family, and they don't understand why, when we were all raised in the same family. Well, in fact, each sibling is an individual, and they are more or less sensitive than the next sibling. So you really can't predict these things.
Exactly. So it's hit or miss, right? And it's interesting because, as with the human condition, there's not 100% possibility of predicting everything. So, but this just gives us a bit of a baseline and a foundation to understand how this can potentially manifest. So let's talk about what this looks like, Fern. I think you came up with a wonderful article that talks about this, and this is really where the meat is when it comes to identifying what this looks like. So there's some behaviors that narcissistic children can display. So let's talk about that.
Well, one of the first characteristics is that they tend to monopolize conversations, and they really don't give their attention to others. They routinely interrupt and often interrogate. So again, as I said earlier, you see this both in adults and children.
I agree. I think this is something that happens a lot, and the need to interrupt, or the need to interrogate, is often based on that need, that insecure need, especially that's manifesting as such. So very important.
And I want to say real quickly, all of narcissism is based in a very deep insecurity. And so all of the traits we're about to identify are speaking to that point.
Yeah. And the next one you had there was the need to be the center of attention. Of course, viewing excessive attention as being their right, and how these children can somehow have unexpected or unrealistic expectations, I should say, of others and such, right?
Right. And if they don't get that attention, they often belittle others or bully them, making themselves better than other children. They have deep feelings of envy, and they will often, in children, you'll see this fighting and stealing toys from others so that they get what they want. And if you can imagine what the toys become in adulthood, you can see the same characteristic in adults.
So very important to watch out for that, of course, and to try to break that sense of egotism, of course. We were talking about that a little bit before the video, about egotism and such, how that manifests in different areas of our lives. Of course, another thing they can do is dismiss other people's feelings and opinions, often act bored or irritated when other people speak, right? So we're talking about that notion before of the inability of in making room for people's personalities, right? So very interesting when you see that.
Yeah, they exclude peers from games and groups on a very superficial basis. So on the basis of appearance, or in adulthood, finance. And these are really the schoolyard bullies.
Yeah, and you can see that very much so, you know. I think that manifests, and we can think of a few people perhaps we've encountered in our lives that tend to be that way. You know, a lack of ability or an inclination to empathize with others, again, I think is interesting to observe as well, where they have that inability to read people, or just a disinterest, if you will, you know.
A disinterest in others, and what they do is they contradict or correct others' behavior in order to insist that they're actually right.
Yeah, exactly. So again, this is something that manifests also as avoiding accountability for their behavior, right? It's never their fault, right? So kids are often like that, right? And it's so important to develop this sense of accountability and responsibility, especially.
They throw temper tantrums when criticized, and when they don't get their way, they're very quick to flare and overreact. And actually, when we think about adult narcissists, we often see them as throwing a 3-year-old tantrum. And so I think you can see the bookends of that.
Absolutely. I think that that's certainly our viewers will definitely relate to that when it comes to identifying some narcissistic siblings and such, you know. They can sometimes threaten verbally or physically and be abusive, right? So they can really have a disproportionate response when it comes to disagreements and such.
They expect attention, agreement, or caretaking without any reciprocity. And I know a lot of people in our support group have talked about the one-way street they live on, and this shows up pretty early in life.
Absolutely, and that's really important that parents can work on that, and we'll get into that in the other part of our video here very soon. They can exaggerate their successes and achievements, diminishing the achievements of those around them, right? So that's also very narcissistic as well.
Pushing back against authority figures, resents being told what to do. That's true in childhood and in adulthood.
Isn't it though, eh?
Yeah.
I think that's very much true, and we see that also in all sorts of areas and industries in life, especially. They tend to avoid eye contact, you know, and people call this a gaze aversion, right? The refusal to look into the eyes of someone that's speaking. And some people have said that this is because they have such a low self-esteem that they can't tolerate the possibility of feeling corrected or rejected and such.
Right. That there again is that low self-esteem / insecurity. They display very little gratitude towards anyone, including their parents, and they often blame their parents for their low self-esteem or for their own wrongdoings.
Yeah, because it's easier to blame other people for their problems, right? So it's something that they typically do, and oftentimes we're the brunt of that, right? So
well, and also they lack self-awareness and they lack introspection. So what's happening is they're not looking at themselves.
no, that's the thing. So another thing that another way that it manifests is by becoming outraged when others don't meet their needs, or expecting others to take responsibility for their emotional well-being, right? So you sometimes have that narcissistic rage that manifests, right? Because of that, you're not doing this enough, and you should get on your game, and you know, all sorts of ways that they can, you know, of course, talk down to someone in that way.
The children engage in pathological play, for example, patterns of vengeance, refusing to accommodate or acknowledge others' needs. And we mentioned that previously. This is the pattern that's constantly emerging in play.
Yeah, exactly. So this is something that's really, really important, of course, to recognize when that manifests. And again, we're back to egotism, right? We want to make sure, of course, that that they can break that level of egotism, you know, because that's really, really important to be able to read other people, read an environment and such. So lacking a moral compass, for example, the ability to identify what's right and wrong, they don't tend to exhibit remorse about lying, cheating, or stealing, you know. So again, this is normal to some extent with children, right? When they start to fib and such, right? but at the same time, you kind of want to see if there's not an underlying pattern that is just based on avoidance and such, and just lacking that moral compass, as we said.
They can be very manipulative both in adulthood and childhood. And that means as children, their language skills are quite sophisticated and advanced so that they can mask some of their shortcomings. And I think it's important to remember that you're dealing with people who learn to gaslight at a very early age.
Yeah, very true, right? They can spin things around very much, and it becomes a skill for them to be able to do that, because they become very expert, like at basically Tefloning onto other people. So just having that rebound effect, so it's really, really important to recognize that and such in younger children. And the other one here that I see is to struggle with stress, often regressing to behavioral stage younger than their developmental level when facing a situation they can't manipulate because they lack the ability to self-soothe. So this is really interesting how they can really amp themselves up. They can wind themselves up, right? And this is really what happens with a lot of them, is that once you start talking with them, then they can start to do that, and it just builds and builds and builds until it just explodes. So this is an important skill, of course, to develop, that we'll talk more about very soon.
Right. They tend to be irritable and over focus on what annoys them.
Mm-hmm. That's the thing.
They also suffer deeply with separation anxiety. And again, I think this speaks to their need to have everything go their own way. And so they're not comfortable when somebody isn't there for them.
Yeah, exactly. They have that difficulty in somehow feeling as though the other person is not playing the role in taking care of them, right? And I see this. People have family members or siblings go into narcissistic rage because somehow they're feeling they're not doing what they need to do. And it is based on a type of separation anxiety, especially, which is why it's so helpful in some ways to protect ourselves from that. And I think this leads us to our next part here, which is really important, right? How do you stop this from happening and protect yourself, right? I think this is such an important question when it comes to working with this. And one of the first things I want to say about this is that there's a lack of proven interventions to prevent or diminish narcissism in young individuals, right? So a crucial first mood in developing such interventions is understanding the factors that contribute to narcissism, right? So if narcissism arises from parental overevaluation, training programs for parents may be an effective approach to restrict the development of narcissistic traits. Now, these programs can assist parents in expressing affection and appreciation to their children without instilling the belief that their children are superior to others, right?
Yeah. The parents unfortunately get a lot of blame in this deal, and it may or may not be their fault. So much of this is a mixture of personality and nurturance and development. So, but the other thing I wanted to say is that unfortunately, narcissism really is pretty fixed in personality, and it's very difficult to change through any of the treatments available at this time.
Yeah. So that's important to mention, but I think also what's important to mention is that there are certain things that we can do, and it's interesting because in therapy, when I have people coming to me and saying they've had a lack of guidance from parents, they need usually a roadmap to follow in terms of what's right and what's wrong for them, So when that happens, I think it's really important to, first of all, foster the ability to read a social situation. I think that's really, really important to be able to do that. Like, what is happening around you? What do you understand in terms of what's happening around you, instead of just focusing on your person per se?
And what's realistic to expect from others.
Yeah. And recognizing that no one's perfect, right? We have flaws that we need to work on. And I think that parents need to give this type of guidance to children, right? when it comes to that type of approach to kids. You're great, you're good, but you still need to work on this. And
Well, and
yeah.
one way to do that is to actually model it. So I made a mistake. I want to take responsibility for what I did here, and I want to apologize. But a lot of parents struggle with that, especially towards their own children.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really, really good way with modeling, because if kids see it, then they can understand it, right?
Mhm.
So that's really, really important. And we said it before, right? Making room for other people's personalities is a good way to avoid dominating others, right? And this goes for as much with kids as it goes for adults as well. Mhm. You know, and of course, there's learning to appreciate and appropriate ourselves, I should say, with regards to emotional regulation strategies. I think that's key when it comes to that, right? If we're kind of winding ourselves up and we're getting really, really angry or irritated, we
Mhm.
really need to appropriate ourselves of these types of strategies to be able to develop tolerance towards discomfort, and especially patience too. Patience is a big one.
Yeah, I think while you may not be able to completely alter the narcissistic traits, you can teach somebody to emotionally regulate somewhat and to self-soothe, which is what's missing in all of this.
Exactly. And conflict management or problem solving strategies are, of course, a very important skill. I think that that's really, really important for us to focus on as well, right? To be able to regulate ourselves, regulate our feelings, learn to work on taming our feelings, but also learning to find out ways in which we can diplomatically help in different situations and interactions with others that can actually help to problem solve as opposed to dominate.
But here's the problem, Ollie John. These people, narcissistic adults, simply do not see that there's anything wrong with them and that they don't need to improve. And so it would take a lot for somebody who's pretty narcissistic to develop these strategies. So they would actually have to look at themselves, and that's just not a quality you see in this kind of personality.
You're right that if the parent is narcissistic and tends to carry on with their own patterns, then there can be, of course, these types of crumbs that develop later on, of course, in children at differing degrees, sometimes mildly to more blatantly. So it's really, really important to be able to look inwards in some ways. And sometimes, having to reevaluate our relationship with the parent also, if they are narcissistic and if they are exhibiting toxic behaviors, may be necessary, not just with a sibling, but also with parents if that's the case as well. So,
Right.
Fern, we're almost out of time. I have to stop here in a few minutes. Let's talk about resources. What would be the number one resource you'd like to mention to our viewers at this time?
Well, I've been doing one-on-one coaching, and that has enriched and certainly expanded my understanding of sibling estrangement. And all I have to say is there are a lot of people who need some support, and I'm getting a lot of requests. So anyway, that's out there as a possibility. And I know you do therapy as well.
Yes, yes, I do have some follow-ups one-on-one with some clients with regards to sibling estrangement as well, to be able to identify the patterns and, of course, break free from obstacles that manifest and such. And of course, I do have the Sibling Estrangement Support Group to help people. It's once every couple of weeks, and it's a very empowering experience for people. People get a lot out of it because they get tools in terms of how to navigate difficult situations, and they can see people of like mind going through similar situations as well. So you're not feeling alone when you're going through this. So important for us to recognize that there's others out there just like you that are experiencing this. And there is, of course, a Facebook group, Sibling Estrangement Sharing, Coping, Connecting, which I have. And you can have conversations in the thriving community like that to be able to empower yourself further. And of course, meet others too. So this has been a wonderful episode, Fern. I'm so happy to be able to do this. It's so important that we talk about this, about how this can manifest in children's lives and what we can do about it, especially. So thank you so much for being a part of this. and I very much look forward to our next episode together.
I do too. Thank you.
All right, you take care.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.